Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic so obscure, so niche, so wonderfully gentle, it might just lull you to sleep before you even realize you've learned something. Imagine yourself transported, not by a clunky time machine, but by the soft rustle of linen, back to the opulent dining rooms of 18th century France. You're seated at a grand table, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and roasted meats, and before you, a masterpiece of folded cloth awaits. This isn't just any cloth, it's a napkin, transformed by skilled hands into an architectural wonder, a delicate bird, or a blossoming flower. This seemingly simple object, often overlooked in our modern grab-and-go world, was once a canvas for an art form, a quiet declaration of status and sophistication. You might think folding a napkin is just folding a napkin, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. You probably won't survive this journey without at least appreciating the sheer dedication involved. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a far simpler time, long before the elaborate flourishes and intricate pleats that would define 18th century dining. Picture the early French table, an affair often more communal and less concerned with individual niceties than you might imagine. In these nascent stages, dining was more about sustenance and less about spectacle. Your meal might be served on a trenchanta, thick slice of stale bread that served as a plateau, perhaps a crude wooden board. Silverware, as we know it, was still evolving. You'd likely be using your fingers, perhaps a shared knife, and certainly not the array of specialized forks that would later become de rigueur. This was a pragmatic approach to eating. Food was meant to be consumed, not admired for its presentation on an intricately folded linen. Think less Michelin star and more peasant feast, albeit sometimes a very well-funded peasant feast. Historians still argue whether the concept of individual dining spaces truly began to solidify during this early period, or if it was a more gradual shift. What is clear is that the idea of a personal cleaning cloth, something dedicated solely to your hands and your mouth, was not yet widespread. Instead, common practice often involved sharing a large cloth placed on the table, or even using the tablecloth itself, a practical, if somewhat unhygienic, solution. Imagine trying to wipe your hands on the same surface everyone else is eating off of. It's a bit like a communal wet wipe, but for your entire meal. This wasn't about elegance. It was about efficiency and, frankly, simply getting by. The focus was on the food itself, the warmth of the hearth, and the convivial atmosphere of shared company, not on the precise angle of a folded linen swan. It was a time when table manners were less about intricate choreography, and more about not elbowing your neighbour, or, eating with both hands if you could manage it. A simpler time indeed, where a clean sleeve might have been your most sophisticated napkin. As you fast forward through the nascent stages of French dining, you begin to see a slow, almost imperceptible shift. The humble, shared cloth gives way to something more refined, driven largely by the magnetic pull of the burgeoning royal courts. Imagine the chateaux of medieval France, not just as fortresses, but as burgeoning centres of culture, where the king's table became a stage. Here, around powerful figures, the desire for order, for a semblance of civility, began to take root. You weren't just eating anymore, you were performing, even if the audience was just your fellow nobles. This was less about hygiene, though that was a happy byproduct, and more about asserting hierarchy and demonstrating status. If you, a distinguished guest, were given your own piece of cloth for wiping, it subtly communicated your importance. It was an early form of VIP treatment, a quiet nod that said, "Yes, you are worthy of your own dedicated fabric for mouth wiping and finger smudging." Historians still argue whether these courtly manners were a genuine evolution of civility, or simply a calculated display of power designed to differentiate the elite from the common rabble. Personally, I lean towards a bit of both. After all, if you're trying to impress visiting dignitaries, having everyone wipe their hands on the tablecloth isn't exactly going to scream sophistication, is it? It's like showing up to a fancy dinner party in your pajamas, comfortable perhaps, but not exactly sending the right message. The influence of these courtly practices slowly trickled down, albeit with varying degrees of success, to the lower nobility and even, eventually, to the burgeoning merchant class. They observed, they imitated, and in doing so, they inadvertently spread the gospel of the personal wiping cloth. You see, when the king does something, everyone else suddenly decides it's the height of fashion. It's the 18th century equivalent of an influencer marketing campaign, but instead of sponsored posts, you had royal decrees and the sheer magnetic force of emulation. The early forms of these personal cloths were likely quite simple. Plain squares of linen, perhaps hemmed, but certainly without the elaborate folds that would come to define their later incarnations. No swans, no intricate fans, just a practical piece of fabric. The fabric itself would have been quite coarse by our standards, a far cry from the delicate damasks that would later grace the tables of Versailles. But, for its time, it was a symbol of progress, a quiet testament to a world slowly, ever so slowly, becoming a little less rough around the edges. As you continue your journey through the evolution of French dining, you arrive at a pivotal moment, the true genesis of the napkin as a distinct and personal item. Before its formal recognition, people were quite resourceful, or perhaps less concerned with what we now consider basic hygiene. Imagine a bustling medieval feast. You might see diners wiping their hands on their sleeves, the tablecloth, or even communal pieces of bread. It was a utilitarian approach, far removed from the choreographed elegance that would later emerge. This was survival, a quick clean-up between mouthfuls of roasted boar or stew. The napkin's true humble origins lie not in a grand design, but in necessity. The earliest forms weren't beautifully folded linen squares. They were likely simple swaths of cloth, perhaps a large shared towel for an entire table, or a smaller, rougher piece of fabric passed around. Some historians even suggest that specialized mouthcloths or handcloths existed informally for centuries, evolving from more general-purpose wiping rags. You can almost hear the conversation, "Pass the wiping cloth, please." No, not that one, the one that hasn't seen action since breakfast. It's a rather amusing thought, but entirely plausible given the lack of formalized dining implements. Think about it. Before forks became commonplace, you were often eating with your hands, scooping up stews, tearing at meats. This naturally led to messy fingers. So, a piece of cloth, any piece of cloth, became essential. It was a practical tool, not a decorative one. This is where the pragmatic origins clash with our modern understanding of the napkin as a symbol of refinement. Historians still argue whether the invention of the fork truly accelerated the need for more formalized napkins, or if the two evolved in parallel, each influencing the other in a slow dance of dining evolution. What is certain is that as dining became more public, more of a performance, the need for a designated personal cleaning cloth became increasingly apparent. It was a gradual move away from communal habits towards individual accountability for one's own mess. After all, nobody wants to be the person who leaves greasy fingerprints on the Duke's favourite tapestry, right? As you mentally trace the napkin's ascent from a mere utility to an object of art, you encounter a crucial underlying factor, the evolution and availability of fabric itself. In the early periods we discussed, textiles were precious commodities. We're not talking about your local linen superstore here. The production of cloth, particularly fine linen or cotton, was a labour-intensive, time-consuming process. Growing flax, spinning the fibres, weaving them into cloth each step required significant effort and skill. This meant that any fabric, even a simple piece for wiping, carried a certain inherent value. Imagine the sheer cost involved in simply having enough material to dedicate individual pieces to each diner, let alone the extra fabric required for elaborate folds. For centuries, coarser materials like undyed linen or even wool might have been the norm for general table use. These were durable, but certainly not conducive to delicate pleats or intricate designs. The shift began with innovations in textile production. You see, the advent of more efficient looms, improvements in spinning techniques, and the increasing trade networks that brought cotton from further afield, all contributed to making fabric more accessible and, crucially, more affordable. This wasn't an overnight revolution, it was a slow, steady progression. Historians still argue whether the demand for more elaborate table settings spurred textile innovation, or if textile advancements simply allowed pre-existing desires for refinement to manifest. Regardless, as better quality, finer woven linen, and cotton became more readily available, the humble wiping cloth could finally shed its utilitarian shackles and begin its journey towards becoming a canvas. Think about it. Trying to fold a sturdy, rough piece of medieval fabric into a delicate swan would be like trying to sculpt a masterpiece out of concrete. You need a material that cooperates, that drapes, that holds a crease. The availability of such fabrics meant that the concept of a napkin could transcend mere function and begin to embrace form. It also meant that the wealthy could now acquire larger quantities of finer cloth, differentiating themselves further from those still wiping their hands on the communal bread, or, heaven forbid, their own sleeves. The softer, more absorbent materials also offered a level of comfort that previous options simply couldn't, making the act of wiping your mouth a little less like sandpapering your face. This increased comfort, combined with the growing aesthetic potential, paved the way for the napkin's grand transformation. So, you've witnessed the evolution of fabric, making the very idea of a personal napkin more feasible. But what did people do with these early napkins before they became miniature sculptures? You might be imagining delicate folds, perhaps a simple triangle or a neat rectangle, and you'd be largely correct, but for purely practical reasons. These were the pre-folding practices, the era before the art really kicked in. Picture yourself at a table where the emphasis is still on consumption, not presentation. Your napkin, likely a simple square or rectangular piece of linen, would be handed to you, perhaps draped over the arm of a servant, or simply laid flat beside your plate. Its primary purpose was, quite frankly, to catch spills and wipe greasy fingers and mouths. You'd probably just crumple it up after use, or perhaps give it a rudimentary fold, a half fold, a quarter fold to make it more manageable on the table, or tuck it into your waistband or collar. Yes, you read that right. Tucking it into your collar was a perfectly acceptable, even practical way to keep your napkin close at hand and protect your often expensive garments. Imagine trying to explain that fashion choice to a modern-day etiquette consultant. Historians still argue whether the practice of tucking napkins into collars was primarily for practicality, preventing drips on elaborate clothing, or if it also carried a subtle, perhaps even humorous, connotation of readiness for a serious meal. Whatever the reason, it certainly speaks to a time when convenience often trumped strict aesthetic rules. There was no grand design, no intricate manipulation of the cloth to impress. The napkin was a tool, like a spoon or a knife, serving a direct, unglamorous function. It was about containing the mess, not creating a showpiece. Think of it less as origami and more as a helpful rag. This simplicity also meant less fuss for the household staff. They didn't need to be master folders, they just needed to be adept at laundry, which, considering the lack of modern washing machines, was an entirely different kind of Herculean effort. The idea of transforming a napkin into a decorative element was still a whisper on the wind, a fancy not yet fully formed in the minds of even the most sophisticated hosts. The canvas was there, the paint was becoming available, but the artists hadn't yet picked up their brushes. You've witnessed the napkin's humble origins, its basic utility. Now imagine a subtle but profound shift occurring at the French dining table, the move from communal dishes and shared cloths to the distinct pleasure of individual service. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow, graceful waltz towards personal space and elevated hygiene. For centuries, dining was often a shared experience in the most literal sense. Platters of food would be placed in the centre, and diners would reach in, often with their hands, to take what they desired. It was efficient, social, and frankly, a bit of a free-for-all by modern standards. However, as society grew more refined, particularly within the burgeoning aristocracy and the increasingly influential bourgeois class, the concept of individual portions and personal implements began to take hold. You no longer dipped your fingers into the same bowl as your neighbour. Instead, a servant might present you with your own plate, your own knife, and crucially, your own napkin. This shift wasn't just about avoiding germs, though that was a bonus. It was deeply intertwined with emerging notions of privacy, personal space, and, let's be honest, a subtle flexing of wealth. Providing each guest with their own full set of dining accoutrements was a clear statement. We have enough, and we value your individual comfort and dignity. It's like the difference between a buffet line and a sit-down, plated mealone is about abundance, the other about curated experience. Historians still argue whether this move to individual service was primarily driven by evolving health consciousness, an increasing emphasis on personal etiquette, or simply a byproduct of greater affluence allowing for such lavish provisions. What is undeniable is its impact on the napkin. Once a shared resource, it now became an extension of the diner's personal sphere. This transformation elevated its status from a mere wiping rag to a component of a more structured, personal dining experience. No longer did you have to wonder whose gravy stains you were sharing. Your napkin was yours, a pristine canvas awaiting your mealtime ministrations. This personal ownership laid the groundwork for the napkin to become something more than just functional. It allowed for the possibility of it becoming decorative, a little piece of art just for you. After all, if it's solely for your use, why not make it pretty? Now, you're standing at the precipice of true magnificence, where the humble napkin takes a dizzying leap from mere utility to an undisputed art form. This transformation is almost entirely thanks to one man, or rather, the sprawling, sun-drenched shadow he cast over France, King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Imagine Versailles not just as a palace, but as a meticulously choreographed stage, where every detail, from the cut of a velvet doublet to the placement of a silver fork, was designed to reflect the monarch's unparalleled power and glory. Under Louis XIV, dining ceased to be a simple act of consumption and became a highly ritualized public spectacle. Eating was not just for nourishment, it was a performance, a demonstration of absolute monarchy. Every meal, particularly those attended by the king, was a carefully orchestrated ballet of servants, dishes, and, of course, linens. You see, when the most powerful man in Europe dines, he doesn't just eat. He embodies the grandeur of his nation, and everything around him had to reflect that. This wasn't about being efficient, it was about being awe-inspiring. This insatiable desire for grandeur permeated every aspect of court life, including the table. Louis XIV, with his penchant for order and elaborate display, naturally demanded the same from his dining settings. This is where the napkin truly came into its own. No longer was it merely a cloth to wipe your hands. It was a canvas. Court designers and household managers, eager to curry favour and reflect the king's magnificence, began experimenting with ways to make these linens visually stunning. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV himself took a direct interest in napkin folding, or if it was simply a natural byproduct of his demand for absolute perfection in every detail of court life. My guess? He probably just pointed and said, "Make it pretty," and then left his army of creative minds to figure out the how. This era saw the very first glimmerings of what we now recognise as elaborate napkin folds. They weren't yet the complex origami we'll explore, but they were certainly beyond the crumpled heap or the simple triangle. They were geometric, architectural, designed to add another layer of visual richness to an already overwhelming tableau of gold, silver, and crystal. Every fold, every crease, every perfectly placed linen became a silent testament to the boundless wealth and meticulous order of the Sun King's court. It was a subtle, yet potent reminder that even the simplest objects in his orbit were touched by his extraordinary power. As you stand in the dazzling glow of Louis XIV's court, witnessing the burgeoning grandeur of table settings, a crucial need arises. How do you standardize all this newfound elegance? It's one thing for a creative courtier to invent a fancy new fold. It's another to teach it to an entire retinue of household staff, ensuring uniformity across countless banquets. This, my friend, is where the emergence of folding manuals becomes absolutely vital. Imagine a world without YouTube tutorials or even photographs. How do you convey the precise angles, the intricate pleats, the specific sequence of folds that transform a flat piece of linen into a standing pheasant or a blossoming rose? You write it down, of course. These early folding manuals were, in essence, the very first how-to guides for table artistry. They were often beautifully illustrated, sometimes with woodcuts or engravings, attempting to visually guide the reader through each step. Think of them as the 18th century equivalent of an IKEA instruction booklet, but for napkins, and probably a lot more frustrating to follow without modern diagrams. These manuals weren't mass-produced paperbacks you'd pick up at a bookstall. They were often exclusive, produced for aristocratic households, or circulated amongst the highest echelons of professional household staff, like the maître d'hôtel or the chief steward. They contain not just instructions for specific folds, but also detailed advice on selecting the right linen, starching techniques, and even the etiquette surrounding the placement and use of the folded napkin. It was a comprehensive education in the art of the table. One famous example, though slightly later, is the Kunstbuchlein, or Little Art Book from Germany, which showcased numerous designs. While this wasn't strictly French, it reflects the broader European interest sparked by French courtly practices. Historians still argue whether these manuals were primarily for practical instruction, ensuring consistency, or if they also served as status symbols in themselves, demonstrating the owner's knowledge of the latest fashionable refinements. My bet? A bit of both. You learn from it, then display it prominently to subtly show off your sophisticated tastes. After all, if you've gone to the trouble of mastering the bishop's hat, you certainly want people to know it. These manuals solidified the napkin's place as a legitimate art form, providing the blueprint for its intricate future. With the emergence of formal manuals, the art of napkin folding began to standardize, and as you flip through the hypothetical pages of an 18th century instruction guide, you'd immediately notice a prevailing aesthetic. Geometric folds dominate. Forget the flowing organic shapes that might come to mind from modern linen art. The initial preference was for precision, symmetry, and architectural exactitude. Imagine the Enlightenment era's love affair with order, reason, and mathematical principles. This wasn't just confined to philosophy or city planning, it permeated the domestic arts as well. The earliest elaborate napkin folds mirrored this intellectual current. You'd find intricate starbursts, precise pyramids, perfectly proportioned fans, and towering multi-layered structures that looked as if they could have been designed by an architect. These weren't whimsical creations. They were demonstrations of skill, control, and an almost scientific approach to textile manipulation. It was about proving mastery over the material, forcing the soft linen into rigid, preconceived forms. Think of it like this. If you were trying to impress a duke who spent his afternoons discussing Euclidean geometry, you wouldn't present him with a floppy, asymmetrical blob of fabric. No, you'd give him a napkin folded with such precision that it looked like it could hold up a small building. Each crease would be sharp, each angle perfect, a testament to the household staff's unwavering attention to detail and perhaps their secret stash of extra strong starch. Historians still argue whether this preference for geometric forms was purely an aesthetic choice, reflecting the prevailing artistic movements, or if it also served a practical purpose, making the folds more stable and less likely to collapse during a long, boisterous dinner. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Sturdy geometry certainly would have helped maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. These early folds required immense patience and a keen eye for detail. You weren't just folding, you were engineering. The resulting structures often stood upright on the plate, forming a dramatic centerpiece for each diner. They weren't meant to be easily unfolded and used. In many cases, they were so stiffly starched and intricately constructed that unfolding them would have been a minor act of destruction. Their primary purpose was visual splendor, a silent proclamation of the host's refined taste and the household's impeccable standards. It was a time when the napkin was less about wiping your mouth and more about making your jaw drop. As you continue to marvel at the geometric precision of 18th century napkin folds, another layer of complexity unfurls. The fascinating world of symbolism in early folds. These weren't just pretty shapes. Many carried hidden meanings, subtle messages, or reflected the prevailing interests and values of the elite society that embraced them. Imagine attending a grand banquet. The folded napkin before you, perhaps a towering pyramid or a complex star, wasn't just a random design. It might subtly reference the host's coat of arms, a significant historical event, or even a philosophical concept popular at the time. For instance, a fold resembling a crown or a fleur-de-lis would unequivocally declare loyalty to the monarchy, a common and politically shrewd choice in courtly circles. A geometric design mimicking a fortress or a castle could allude to strength, security, or the family's ancient lineage. It was a visual language, understood by the discerning few, adding another layer of intrigue to the dining experience. This wasn't always explicit. Sometimes the symbolism was more abstract, reflecting popular allegories or the scientific curiosities of the age. Folds that mimicked celestial bodies or complex mathematical diagrams might hint at the host's intellectual leanings or an interest in the Enlightenment's pursuit of knowledge. Historians still argue whether all these symbolic interpretations were universally understood by contemporary diners, or if some were simply retroactive analyses by later scholars. My guess? Like much art, the more layered the meaning, the more one could impress fellow connoisseurs. It was a subtle way to show off your cultural literacy without having to actually say anything. The most famous and enduring examples often represented animals or natural forms, albeit in a highly stylized, almost architectural manner, fitting the geometric preference of the era. A popular fold resembling a bird, like a swan or a crane, might symbolize grace, purity, or longevity. A more intricate design resembling a ship could signify trade, travel, or naval power, especially in port cities or for families involved in maritime ventures. These weren't just decorative, they were conversational icebreakers, silent declarations, and sometimes even subtle political statements. The napkin, once a mere utility, had truly ascended to become a carrier of meaning, a tiny folded Rosetta Stone of 18th century aristocratic values. You weren't just wiping your hands, you were decoding a miniature masterpiece. Having delved into the symbolic nuances of these geometric napkin folds, you might be wondering, who was actually doing all this intricate folding? This brings us to a crucial, often overlooked aspect of the 18th century household, the meticulous process of training the household staff. This wasn't a casual affair, it was a rigorous, demanding apprenticeship in the art of domestic perfection. Imagine being a new servant, perhaps a footman or a scullery maid with aspirations, brought into a grand aristocratic household. Your duties would extend far beyond scrubbing floors or serving wine. You would be expected to master a dizzying array of skills, and among the most prized, especially in a household aiming for the pinnacle of courtly elegance, was the ability to prepare the table. This included, of course, the painstaking art of napkin folding. This wasn't just a quick demonstration. It was hours, days, sometimes weeks of practice, often supervised by the maître d'hôtel or the chief steward, who themselves would have mastered these techniques. The training would have involved endless repetition, much like learning a complex musical instrument or a difficult dance. You would start with the simplest folds, mastering the crispness of each crease, the precise alignment of edges. Then, gradually, you'd progress to the more intricate geometric designs, learning the specific sequence of turns, pleats, and tucks required to bring a pyramid or a starburst to life. Imagine the frustration when a fold wouldn't hold or a crease wasn't sharp enough, knowing that the reputation of the entire household, and by extension your own employment, depended on your dexterity. Historians still argue whether the training was purely practical, focused on achieving perfect results, or if it also instilled a sense of pride and artistic appreciation among the servants for their craft. I'd wager it was a bit of both, a tedious task elevated by the undeniable beauty of the final product. The best folders would have had a natural aptitude, a fine motor skill akin to a surgeon's. They would have been responsible for preparing dozens, sometimes hundreds of napkins for a single grand banquet. Think of the sheer volume. Each one had to be perfect, pristine, and identical to its neighbour. This wasn't just a job, it was a highly specialised skill, often passed down through generations of household staff. A servant, known for their exceptional napkin folding ability, would have been a valuable asset, highly sought after by noble families eager to outshine their rivals in the subtle yet fierce competition of domestic splendour. It was a silent testament to the unseen labour that underpinned the dazzling facade of aristocratic life. You've seen the rigorous training, the painstaking effort that went into each fold. Now, let's consider why all this effort was expended. It wasn't merely for aesthetic pleasure, it was deeply intertwined with social status and napkin art. In 18th century France, every detail of domestic life, especially at the grand dining table, was a carefully constructed signal of wealth, power, and refinement. Imagine yourself as a guest, entering a lavish dining room. Before you even taste the food, your eyes would sweep across the table, taking in the gleaming silver, the sparkling crystal, and the pristine, intricately folded linens. The complexity and artistry of the napkin folds weren't just pretty, they were a silent yet undeniable declaration of your host's standing. A simple, flat napkin, perhaps acceptable for a less affluent household, but a soaring pyramid, a stately fan, or an architectural marvel crafted from linen that screamed, "We have vast resources, impeccably trained staff, and an exquisite taste for the finer things in life." It was a sophisticated flex, a quiet boast of superiority. This wasn't just about showing off. It was about maintaining one's position within a highly stratified society. Nobles competed fiercely, not just on the battlefield or in political intrigue, but in the subtle nuances of their domestic displays. To host a banquet with anything less than perfectly folded napkins would be a social faux pas, a sign of declining fortunes, or, worse, a lack of sophisticated understanding. It would be like showing up to a modern red carpet event in sweatpants. You might be comfortable, but you're certainly not sending the right message. Historians still argue whether this obsession with detailed table settings was a genuine expression of artistic appreciation or primarily a tool for social differentiation. My take? It was probably a very potent combination of both. The beauty was appreciated, but the underlying message of status was never far from mind. The very act of folding these intricate designs required time, a luxury only available to those who didn't have to worry about daily toil. The skilled labour to create them was expensive, further cementing their role as a symbol of affluence. So, when you admired a particularly complex bishop's hat or a perfectly symmetrical double fan, you weren't just appreciating the craftsmanship, you were witnessing a carefully curated performance of social superiority. The napkin, in its folded glory, became a small but powerful emblem of an entire social hierarchy. You've explored the social implications of napkin art. Now let's ground ourselves in the very real, very practical challenges of maintaining such pristine and intricately folded masterpieces. The materials and laundry challenges. This wasn't a world of permanent press or readily available detergents. Linen was a precious commodity, and cleaning it was an arduous, labour-intensive process. Imagine the sheer volume of linen required for a single grand banquet. Each diner would have at least one, often two or three, intricately folded napkins. Multiply that by dozens, if not hundreds, of guests, and you're talking about an enormous pile of fabric that needed to be impeccably white, stiffly starched, and perfectly smooth before a single fold could even begin. The preferred material was typically fine linen, sometimes damask, which offered both durability and a beautiful sheen that enhanced the intricate folds. However, linen, while elegant, wrinkles easily and absorbs stains with remarkable efficiency. The laundry process itself was a monumental undertaking. Forget tossing things into a washing machine. Linen would be soaked, often in lye or ash water, then vigorously scrubbed, beaten, and boiled in enormous copper pots. This was often done outdoors by laundresses with strong arms and endless patience. Imagine trying to remove a stubborn gravy stain or a wine splash from a delicate damask napkin without modern stain removers. It was an art in itself, and a physically demanding one at that. Once cleaned, the linen had to be bleached, typically by spreading it out on grass fields under the sun, a process known as grassing. This natural bleaching was slow and dependent on good weather. Then came the starching. To achieve the crispness required for complex folds, napkins would be heavily starched, often with a mixture of boiled rice or wheat flour. This made the fabric stiff and malleable, allowing it to hold precise creases. Finally, the Irona-heavy flat piece of metal heated over an open fire would be used to press out every wrinkle, ensuring a flawlessly smooth surface before the folding began. Historians still argue whether the extreme starching and meticulous ironing were purely for aesthetic purposes, or if they also helped to preserve the delicate fibres of the expensive linen. My bet, it was a bit of both. Looking good and lasting longer are always a winning combination. This entire process was a hidden army of labour, a testament to the fact that the dazzling display on the table was built upon hours of back-breaking work. The delicate beauty of a folded napkin belied the grit and grime of its creation and maintenance, making it all the more impressive, a symbol of luxury and power. You've just peeled back the curtain on the labour-intensive world of linen care, realising that the perfect napkin was truly a triumph of perseverance. Now, let's broaden your view beyond the specific art of the napkin and consider dining etiquette beyond the napkin in 18th century France. The folded cloth was but one exquisite piece in a much larger, intricately woven tapestry of social rules and expectations that governed every aspect of a grand meal. Imagine yourself at that same lavish table, but now, instead of just focusing on your folded linen, you're observing the entire ritual. This was a time when forks were becoming more common, but weren't universally adopted for all dishes. You'd still encounter finger foods, and knowing when to use your fingers and when to employ a fork was a subtle social cue. For instance, using a fork for certain meats might be considered effeminate or pretentious by some, while using fingers for a delicate pastry could be seen as uncouth by others. It was a minefield of unspoken rules. Beyond cutlery, consider the seating arrangements. Who sat where was a meticulously planned affair reflecting social rank and political alliance. The most important guests were seated closest to the host, and often particular chairs or positions carried significant prestige. You wouldn't simply plop down anywhere, you'd be shown your place, a silent decree of your standing in the pecking order. And the conversation. Light, witty banter was prized, but serious political or business discussions were usually reserved for after the meal or for much more private settings. You wouldn't bring up your grievances with the local tax collector over the asparagus. Then there was the sheer performativity of eating. Guests were expected to eat elegantly, without slurping, chewing loudly, or reaching across the table. Servants moved with silent precision, presenting dishes, clearing plates, and anticipating every need. The choreography was astounding, turning a simple meal into a multi-act play. Historians still argue whether these elaborate etiquette rules were primarily about social control, ensuring that only the truly refined could navigate them, or if they genuinely reflected a desire for a more orderly and pleasant dining experience. My feeling? It created a wonderful barrier to entry for the uninitiated. Even the sequence of dishes, known as service à la française, as opposed to our modern service à la russe, where dishes are brought out one by one, involved multiple courses placed on the table simultaneously, allowing diners to choose. It was a feast for the eyes as much as for the stomach, a cornucopia of culinary delights designed to impress. So, while your perfectly folded napkin was a masterpiece in miniature, it was merely one star in a vast constellation of refined practices designed to elevate dining to an art form, a demonstration of wealth, power, and impeccable taste. You've grasped the wider tapestry of 18th century dining etiquette. Now let's bring our focus back to the napkin, as the artistic currents of the era begin to ripple through its pristine folds. You enter the mid-18th century, a period marked by a shift from the severe grandeur of the Baroque to the softer, more playful aesthetic of the Rococo influence. Imagine the transition from a grand, imposing cathedral to a charming, ornate drawing room. The Rococo style, emerging from France, championed lightness, asymmetry, natural forms, and delicate ornamentation. Think pastel colours, sinuous curves, seashells, and whimsical flourishes, a stark contrast to the rigid, heavy gold and dark marble of the previous era. This artistic shift wasn't confined to painting or architecture. It permeated the decorative arts, and naturally, it found its way to the dining table. For napkin folding, this meant a departure from the purely geometric, architectural forms that had dominated under Louis XIV. While precision was still valued, the shapes themselves began to soften, to curve, and suggest organic life. You'd still see fans, but perhaps they'd be more gracefully fanned, less rigidly pleated. Pyramids might give way to more fluid, draped designs. The emphasis shifted from monumental structure to elegant, almost whimsical beauty. It was as if the napkins themselves were exhaling a sigh of relief, shedding their stiff, formal corsets for something a little more flowing and free. Historians still argue whether this shift was a direct, conscious adoption of Rococo principles in napkin folding, or if it was a more subconscious evolution as societal tastes broadly softened. My take: when everyone else is painting cherubs and seashells on their ceilings, it's hard to keep folding your napkins into a rigid, angular fortress without feeling a little bit behind the times. The materials themselves might have also played a role. As finer, softer linens became available, they lent themselves more naturally to these delicate, curved forms. This softening of style paved the way for more representational folds, moving beyond abstract geometry to designs that evoked the natural world. It was a subtle, yet significant evolution that demonstrated the napkin's adaptability as a medium for artistic expression. The table was no longer just a display of power, but also a reflection of refined aesthetic sensibilities, where even the smallest detail contributed to an overall atmosphere of graceful charm and effortless elegance. The napkin was learning to dance. You've just witnessed the softening influence of the Rococo, a gentle artistic breeze that began to curve the rigid lines of napkin art. This aesthetic shift paved the way for something truly delightful: the flourishing of animals and nature folds. No longer confined to abstract geometry, the humble linen began to blossom into a veritable menagerie and garden, right there on your plate. Imagine the delight of sitting down to dinner and finding a perfectly sculpted linen bird perched beside your soup bowl, its wings delicately spread, or a blooming rose with meticulously layered petals awaiting your gaze. This was the era where the napkin truly came alive, transforming from a static architectural form into a whimsical, charming representation of the natural world. Swans were particularly popular, their elegant necks and gracefully curved bodies lending themselves beautifully to the pliable fabric. Peacocks, with their fanned tails, offered another opportunity for intricate pleating and display. But it wasn't just birds. You'd find fish, rabbits, even more exotic animals if the folder was particularly skilled and ambitious. Beyond creatures, botanical motifs became prominent. Flowers, from delicate roses to more abstract blossoms, were a common sight, bringing a touch of the garden indoors. You might even encounter more elaborate landscape-inspired folds, though these were exceptionally difficult and rare. It was like bringing a miniature, textile-based ecosystem to the dining table, a playful counterpoint to the formality of the meal. Historians still argue whether this move towards naturalistic forms was purely an aesthetic evolution, a reaction against the previous era's stiffness, or if it also reflected a burgeoning interest in natural history and botany, which were gaining popularity in scholarly and aristocratic circles. Perhaps it was a charming way to subtly integrate scientific curiosity with domestic elegance. What is certain is that these folds demanded an even higher level of dexterity and artistic sensibility than their geometric predecessors. They required not just precise creases, but a feel for organic form, an ability to coax the fabric into lifelike curves and contours. It was like learning to sculpt, but with linen. And let's be honest, who wouldn't be charmed by a perfectly folded linen rabbit sitting patiently on their plate, waiting for the bread rolls? It was an unexpected moment of joy and whimsy in an otherwise very structured environment, proving that even at the most formal tables, a touch of playful artistry could bloom. You've seen the napkins morph into graceful swans and delicate roses. Now, imagine a world where this intricate craft transcended mere domestic display and became a fierce competition. Welcome to the era of competitive folding exhibitions, where the mastery of linen became a public spectacle, a quiet but intense battle for bragging rights and prestige. This wasn't a formal televised event like a modern culinary competition, but rather informal challenges and demonstrations held within the grand houses of the aristocracy or between rival noble families. Imagine a host proudly showcasing their household's newly perfected phoenix fold, subtly daring their dinner guests, perhaps from a competing estate, to produce anything half as impressive. Or perhaps, during a long house party, two head stewards might engage in an impromptu fold-off, each attempting to outdo the other with increasingly complex and innovative designs. It was a subtle yet potent form of social one-upmanship. These exhibitions served several purposes. Firstly, they allowed skilled folders, often the maître d'hôtel or specific valets known for their linen artistry, to demonstrate their prowess and enhance their reputation. A household with a reputation for groundbreaking napkin folds would attract more discerning guests and elevate its social standing. Secondly, they spurred innovation. When you know your rival household is attempting a new chariot fold, you're certainly going to push your own staff to create something even more astonishing. It was an unspoken arms race of linen. Historians still argue whether these competitive displays were driven by genuine artistic passion, a playful spirit of rivalry, or simply a further manifestation of the era's obsession with status and display. My bet? It was a delicious mix of all three, with the underlying current of status running strongest. After all, if you can fold a linen pineapple that stands perfectly erect for the entire 5-hour banquet, you're not just demonstrating skill, you're demonstrating control, patience, and access to truly exceptional starch. These competitions, even if informal, pushed the boundaries of what was possible with a piece of cloth, leading to increasingly elaborate and sometimes impossibly intricate designs. It was the Olympics of tablecloths, where the gold medal was silent admiration and a knowing nod from your aristocratic peers. The pressure must have been immense. Imagine an entire evening's reputation resting on the perfect crease of a swan's neck. Talk about high stakes. You've just witnessed the exhilarating, if unspoken, world of competitive napkin folding. Now, let's expand our view from the grand French courts and consider how this delicate art form didn't stay confined within the gilded walls of Versailles. Instead, through various channels, it began travelling and diffusing across Europe, planting seeds of linen artistry in other noble households. Imagine the network of ambassadors, diplomats, and royal family members crisscrossing the continent. When a German prince visited the court of France, or a French noblewoman married into an Italian ducal family, they didn't just bring their clothes and jewels, they brought their customs, their tastes, and their household staff. A skilled maître d'hôtel, or a particularly adept valet, trained in the intricate French methods of table setting and napkin folding, would be a prized asset, often accompanying their master or mistress to new lands. These individuals became silent, cultural ambassadors, meticulously replicating the sophisticated practices they had learned. Furthermore, the very manuals we discussed earlier, those exquisitely illustrated how-to guides, also travelled. While not mass-produced, copies would be commissioned, gifted, or even illicitly acquired by rival courts eager to emulate French elegance, which was, at the time, the gold standard for European refinement. A German baron, keen to impress his peers, might dispatch an agent to secretly acquire a French folding manual, hoping to elevate his own dining experiences. It was a form of soft power, where cultural influence spread as effectively as political treaties. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of these elaborate folding techniques was primarily due to direct emulation of French court practices, or if similar impulses for display and refinement were emerging independently across European aristocracies. My hunch, a generous dollop of emulation seasoned with a dash of local adaptation. Each court might have put its own slight spin on the designs, perhaps incorporating local symbols or stylistic preferences. But the fundamental techniques and the underlying philosophy of the napkin as an art object were undeniably French in origin. This diffusion meant that within a few decades you could find intricate napkin folds not just in Paris and Versailles, but in the palaces of Vienna, the stately homes of London, and the villas of Florence. The art transcended borders, proving that good taste, or at least impressive displays of it, had a universal appeal. It became a shared language of luxury, a subtle way for European elites to communicate their shared understanding of refinement and their participation in a sophisticated pan-European culture. The folded napkin, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, it might not have been a lifesaver, but it certainly travelled much better than certain beauty treatments of the era, gracefully making its way across the continent, one meticulously creased fold at a time. You've traced the grand journey of napkin art across Europe, a testament to its widespread appeal. But as with all trends, particularly those demanding immense effort and resources, a turning point eventually arrives. We now approach the period marking the decline of elaborate folds, a slow, almost imperceptible shift away from the dizzying heights of intricate linen sculpture. Imagine the sheer practical burden. We've discussed the intense labour involved in laundry, starching, and the meticulous folding itself. For every grand banquet, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these textile masterpieces had to be created from scratch. This was incredibly time-consuming and required a significant, highly skilled household staff. As the 18th century wore on, and certainly heading towards its tumultuous end, this level of constant high-maintenance display became increasingly difficult to sustain for many households. The novelty, perhaps, also began to wear off. What was once astonishing became commonplace and then, perhaps, even a little bit tiresome. Moreover, aesthetic tastes continued to evolve. The Rococo's playful curves eventually gave way to the more austere classical lines of neoclassicism, a style that valued simplicity, symmetry, and reason over extravagant ornamentation. Think less whimsical cherubs and more serious Greek statues. This shift in artistic preference naturally impacted table settings. An overly elaborate, highly theatrical napkin fold might suddenly seem out of place in a dining room striving for classical restraint. It would be like wearing a full Renaissance gown to a minimalist modern art gallery open in it, just doesn't quite fit the vibe. Historians still argue whether the decline was primarily due to changing aesthetic trends, the increasing practical difficulties of maintaining such an art form, or the economic and social pressures mounting in pre-revolutionary France. My take? It was a perfect storm of all three. The world was simply moving on, becoming faster, more practical, and less inclined to spend hours crafting a linen pheasant that would be unfolded in seconds. There was also a growing emphasis on genuine comfort and less on rigid display. The idea that a napkin was primarily for wiping your mouth rather than simply being a static decoration, began to reassert itself. The magnificent, ephemeral sculptures of linen started to shrink, to simplify, to eventually become less prominent. The grand theatrical performance of the table was slowly, gently, winding down, preparing for a more pragmatic act. You've just witnessed the subtle, yet significant, waning of elaborate napkin artistry. Now, brace yourself, because the next shift isn't subtle at all. We are about to plunge into the maelstrom that was the French Revolution's impact, a societal earthquake that fundamentally reshaped not only the political landscape, but also the intimate sphere of dining customs. Imagine the guillotine as the ultimate symbol of a radical break with the past. The aristocracy, those very patrons who had fostered and celebrated the intricate art of napkin folding, found themselves either fleeing for their lives, imprisoned, or worse. Their grand estates were seized, their lavish lifestyles dismantled, and their meticulously trained household staffs dispersed. The very notion of elaborate, ostentatious display, once a mark of prestige, suddenly became a dangerous liability, a symbol of the very opulence that the revolutionaries reviled. In this climate of radical change, who would dare to spend hours folding linen swans when the cry for equality and austerity echoed through the streets? The idea of displaying immense wealth through frivolous table decorations would have been not just unfashionable, but politically suicidal. The focus shifted dramatically from aristocratic pomp to republican simplicity. Dining became, at least ostensibly, less about performance and more about egalitarian communal meals. The sumptuous banquets of the Ancien Régime were replaced by more humble, yet ideologically charged gatherings. Historians still argue whether the decline of elaborate napkin folding was a direct casualty of the revolution's violence and social upheaval, or if it was simply accelerated by it, as tastes were already shifting. My take? The revolution certainly delivered the coup de grace. It wasn't just a change in fashion, it was a forced dismantling of the entire social structure that supported such intricate displays. The very skilled folders themselves, if they weren't in hiding, would have found their talents utterly redundant in a society that valued plainness over pretense. The emphasis moved from impressing with visual spectacle to demonstrating civic virtue and equality. A simple, practical napkin, perhaps even a basic, unfolded piece of cloth, became the norm. It was a rejection of everything the elaborate folds had stood for: hierarchy, excess, and a rigid social order. The revolutionary fervour swept away not just kings and queens, but also the delicate, folded symbols of their power, leaving behind a much plainer table, stripped bare of its former aristocratic flourishes. The art form didn't just decline, it faced an existential threat, caught in the crossfire of a nation in turmoil. You've witnessed the revolutionary hammer fall on the elaborate world of napkin art. The aftermath of the French Revolution wasn't just about political restructuring, it ushered in a profound post-revolution simplification of nearly every aspect of life, especially dining. The sheer scale and opulence of the old regime's table settings became not just impractical, but socially undesirable. Imagine a society striving for a new identity, one that rejected the excesses of its monarchical past. Displaying wealth through extravagant, labour-intensive napkin folds would be antithetical to the new republican ideals of simplicity and equality. The focus shifted from grand theatrical feasts to more modest, albeit still refined, gatherings. The very idea of spending hours meticulously crafting linen masterpieces for a meal seemed utterly out of step with the times. It was a conscious rejection of aristocratic frivolity in favour of a more utilitarian, less ostentatious approach to dining. This simplification wasn't just ideological, it was also practical. Many noble families who survived the revolution had lost their fortunes, their estates, and crucially, their highly skilled household staffs. The expertise to execute complex folds was either gone, in exile, or simply no longer in demand. Even if one wanted to recreate the elaborate displays of yesteryear, the resources and the skilled labour were often no longer available. You can't fold a perfect bishop's hat if your last remaining servant is busy trying to find bread for dinner. Historians still argue whether this simplification was a natural evolution that would have occurred anyway, albeit at a slower pace, or if the revolution acted as a definitive catalyst, irrevocably breaking with centuries of tradition. My take? The revolution certainly slammed the brakes on aristocratic display. The lingering distrust of overt luxury meant that even those who could afford elaborate settings often chose not to, lest they be seen as clinging to the ways of the discredited past. The napkins that remained on tables were likely simple rectangles or squares, perhaps folded once or twice for neatness, but certainly devoid of the architectural wonders or animalistic forms that once graced them. Their purpose reverted to pure function, to protect clothing and wipe mouths. The aesthetic appeal of the napkin now lay in its cleanliness, its quality of linen, and its practical utility rather than its intricate form. It was a clear signal that a new era had dawned, one where elegance was redefined not by extravagance, but by a quieter, more understated approach to domestic life. The show was over, and practicality had taken centre stage. You've seen the post-revolutionary simplification. Now, let's fast forward a bit across the channel and into the era that would truly solidify the napkin's identity as a functional item rather than an art piece. The Victorian era's practicality. While this isn't strictly 18th century France, the influence of this subsequent period on our modern understanding of the napkin is undeniable, reflecting a broader European trend. Imagine stepping into a Victorian dining room. While still formal by today's standards, there's a distinct shift in emphasis. The earlier French courtly display, with its focus on elaborate ephemeral artistry, gave way to a more sober bourgeois sensibility. The Victorians valued utility, hygiene, and a certain robust efficiency in their domestic arrangements. Their aesthetics leaned towards solidity, comfort, and perhaps a touch of moral uprightness. An overly decorative napkin, one that seemed to prioritize form over function, might have been seen as a frivolous excess, almost un-Victorian in its impracticality. For the Victorians, the napkin was, first and foremost, a practical necessity for maintaining cleanliness during a meal. They were concerned with hygiene, a growing societal awareness, and ensuring that one presented oneself neatly at the table. While a simple, neat fold might still be employed, such as a triangle or a rectangle, the days of towering linen structures, delicate swans, or complex symbolic designs were largely over. There was little appetite for spending hours on something that would be unfolded and soiled within minutes. It was like appreciating a beautifully wrapped present, but then having to spend an hour just trying to open it. Eventually, you just want to get to the gift. Historians still argue whether the Victorian emphasis on practicality was a direct reaction against the perceived excesses of the Ancien Régime, a natural evolution towards efficiency, or simply a reflection of the burgeoning middle class's values. My guess? It was a combination of all these factors. As industrialization made certain goods more accessible, and as the middle class gained more influence, the old aristocratic displays felt increasingly out of touch. The napkin became a workhorse, not a show horse. Its purpose was to be functional, absorbent, and easily laundered, not to be a conversation piece. This period cemented the idea that a napkin's primary role was to facilitate a clean and tidy dining experience, a far cry from its previous life as a miniature textile sculpture. The beauty was now in its crispness, its cleanliness, and its silent efficiency. You've journeyed through the rise and fall of elaborate napkin art, past the practical Victorians, and now you arrive in our own time, where you can still spot the modern napkin folding echoes. While the grand, intricate displays of 18th century France are largely relics of the past, their legacy quietly persists, shaping the way we encounter linens today. Imagine walking into a fine dining restaurant, perhaps for a special anniversary dinner, or attending a beautifully orchestrated wedding reception. You'll rarely, if ever, encounter a stiff architectural pyramid or a delicate, starched swan standing proudly on your plate. Instead, you'll likely see a neatly folded fan, a simple bishop's hat, or perhaps a refined pocket fold designed to hold the silverware. These aren't the impossible feats of textile engineering from centuries past. They are simplified, elegant gestures that hint at the historical grandeur without demanding hours of a professional folder's time. These modern echoes serve a different purpose. They elevate the dining experience just a touch, signalling attention to detail and a commitment to presentation, even if that presentation is understated. A well-folded napkin tells you, subtly, that the establishment cares about your experience, that they've put in that extra little effort. It's a nod to tradition, a whisper of past elegance, made practical for today's fast-paced world. You wouldn't expect a restaurant to spend all night folding hundreds of elaborate designs, because frankly, diners wouldn't likely appreciate the immense effort in the same way, and the cost would be astronomical. It's the difference between a grand opera and a beautifully composed acoustic song. Historians still argue whether the persistence of even these simplified folds is a testament to the enduring human desire for aesthetic beauty in everyday objects, or simply a lingering tradition passed down through hospitality training. My take? It's a blend of both. There's a certain timeless elegance to a crisp, well-folded napkin that adds a layer of sophistication to a meal. It speaks to a sense of occasion, transforming a simple act of eating into something a bit more special. These are the descendants of those grand French creations, stripped of their excessive pomp but retaining their essential charm. They remind us that, even in our functional modern lives, there's still room for a touch of artistry, a brief moment of quiet beauty before we unfold the linen and get down to the business of eating. The echoes are faint, but they are undeniably there, a subtle tribute to an almost forgotten art. You've seen the echoes of the past in modern dining. Now, let's take a moment to truly appreciate the enduring legacy of elegance left by this once vibrant art form. While the specific practice of elaborate napkin folding may no longer be a widespread competitive pursuit, its spirit continues to influence our understanding of refinement and attention to detail. Think about what those 18th century folds represented. They weren't just about neatness, they were about transformation. They took a simple, utilitarian piece of fabric and, through human ingenuity and skill, elevated it into something beautiful, something almost magical. This dedication to elevating the mundane, to finding artistry in everyday objects, is a legacy that transcends the specific act of folding linen. It speaks to a deeper human desire to infuse our lives with beauty, even in the smallest of details. This legacy can be seen in various aspects of our contemporary world. Consider the art of flower arranging, the careful presentation of a gourmet meal, or even the meticulous way a tailor presses a suit. All these practices carry a thread of the same philosophy, that precision, care, and an aesthetic eye can turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. The folded napkin, in its historical context, was a micro-expression of a broader cultural value, that excellence extended to every corner of a well-ordered life, particularly within the domestic sphere. Historians still argue whether the pursuit of such detailed elegance in the past was a genuine artistic impulse or primarily a means of social differentiation and control. My take? It was both. And the enduring lesson is that genuine artistry, even when serving a social function, often creates beauty that outlives its immediate purpose. The meticulousness required, the patience, the dedication to achieving perfection with a simple piece of clothes are qualities that we still admire, even if applied to different crafts today. The art of napkin folding reminds us that even objects destined for temporary use can be imbued with grace and sophistication. It encourages us to look for beauty in unexpected places, to appreciate the quiet skill behind seemingly simple acts. It's a subtle prompt to slow down, to notice the details, and to consider the effort that goes into creating an atmosphere of elegance. So, next time you see a neatly folded napkin, even a simple one, remember its illustrious ancestors and the grand tradition of elegance it quietly carries forward. It's a testament to the fact that beauty, in all its forms, always finds a way to leave its mark. You've explored the enduring legacy of elegance, tracing the faint lines of historical napkin art into our present day. Now, let's bring our journey to a gentle close by considering the act of folding as a mindful practice. In a world that often demands speed and efficiency, the deliberate, precise movements of folding, whether linen or anything else, offer a quiet counterpoint, a moment of focused calm. Imagine yourself not as an 18th century servant under pressure, but as someone in the present moment taking a fresh, crisp napkin in your hands. The smooth texture of the fabric, the gentle rustle as you begin to press a crease, the satisfying way the material responds to your touch. Each fold requires attention, a small act of presence. You're not thinking about your to-do list or the latest news. You're simply focused on aligning edges, smoothing surfaces, and creating a clean, symmetrical form. This engagement with the tactile and the visual, the quiet rhythm of the process, can be remarkably meditative. In a way, the historical obsession with precise napkin folds, despite its social underpinnings, inadvertently stumbled upon a form of mindfulness. The painstaking repetition, the pursuit of perfection in a simple task, can be deeply grounding. It's like the intricate patterns of a mandala or the careful strokes of calligraphy. The true value isn't just in the finished product, but in the focused journey of its creation. Historians still argue whether such manual tasks ever offered a genuine sense of inner peace to the often overworked staff of the past, or if it was purely a utilitarian skill. Perhaps for some, amidst the drudgery, there was a fleeting moment of quiet satisfaction in the perfect fold. Today, we might not fold elaborate linen swans for every meal, but the principle remains. Think of the calming satisfaction of perfectly folding laundry or carefully wrapping a gift. It's a small, deliberate act that brings order to chaos, precision to the pliable. It invites you to slow down, to engage your senses, and to find beauty in the methodical. As the imagery of grand French tables and delicate linen creations begins to fade, allow your mind to drift. The intricate folds, the hidden meanings, the sheer dedication to a fleeting art form, they all speak to a deeper human desire for beauty and order in the world, even if just for a moment. This journey, like a perfectly folded napkin, has presented you with a quiet, fascinating detail from history. Now, as the soft hum of the fan fills your room and the day's worries recede, let the gentle thought of a perfectly creased linen, a silent testament to an elegant past, guide you towards a peaceful slumber. The art of folding, whether napkins or your thoughts, is a gentle way to prepare for rest, sweet dreams.